In love with the wrong woman, the powerful executive's world crumbles when she abandons him. Hello, let's start another beautiful story. Welcome to my channel. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Let's go. Oliver Cole stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office, 60 stories above Manhattan, watching his kingdom of glass and steel stretch toward the horizon. The morning sun caught the edges of nearby skyscrapers, creating a fortress of light that matched his mood, brilliant, sharp, and utterly impenetrable. His reflection stared back at him, immaculate charcoal suit, platinum watch, not a single dark hair out of place. At 38, he was exactly where he'd planned to be, at the top. Cole Investment Partners had just closed another record quarter, and the Wall Street Journal had named him one of the youngest CEOs to watch. Everything was perfect, controlled, exactly as he'd designed it. The intercom buzzed, breaking his reverie. "Mr. Cole, the marketing consultation interviews are starting in 5 minutes. His assistant's voice was crisp, efficient, just as he'd trained her to be. "Thank you, Rebecca." "I'll be right there." Oliver straightened his already straight tie, a habit born of perfectionism rather than necessity. The conference room was prepared to his exact specifications, water pitchers at precise intervals, leather portfolios aligned at perfect right angles, temperature set at exactly 72 degrees. The candidates would be arriving one by one, each hoping to secure the position of marketing director for Cole Investment Partners. The first 4 interviews went exactly as expected. Qualified candidates, impressive resumes, predictable answers. Oliver made neat notes in his leather-bound notebook, though he'd already dismissed each one. They were good, but good wasn't enough. He needed exceptional. Then Margaret Bennett walked in. She wasn't what he expected. Where the others had been careful, conservative in their corporate attire, she wore a deep burgundy dress that somehow managed to be both professional and striking. Her dark hair fell in soft waves past her shoulders, natural, not styled into submission. But it was her eyes that caught him off guard, green gold and direct, meeting his gaze without a hint of the usual intimidation his presence inspired. "Mr. Cole," she said, extending her hand. Her handshake was firm, confident. "Thank you for considering my application." Oliver gestured to the chair across from him, noting how she moved with an easy grace that seemed to ignore the room's careful formality. She placed her portfolio on the table, slightly askew from the precise angle he'd set. "Your resume is impressive. Ms. Bennett," he began, forcing his attention to the paper in front of him. "Though I notice you've moved between several major firms in the past few years." A slight smile played at the corners of her mouth. "I go where the challenges are, Mr. Cole. Once I've accomplished what I set out to do, I move on to the next mountain to climb. Some might call that unstable. Some might call it passionate about growth." She leaned forward slightly. "I've researched your company extensively, Mr. Cole. You've built something impressive. Stable, profitable, respected, but your brand lacks soul." Oliver felt his eyebrows rise. No one spoke to him this directly anymore. "Soul isn't quantifiable, Ms. Bennett. Numbers are." "That's where you're wrong." She pulled a tablet from her bag, fingers dancing across the screen. "May I?" Without waiting for his response, she stood and walked to the wall screen, connecting her device. Images began to flow across the display, a marketing campaign she'd developed for a competing firm. But it wasn't just advertisements. It was a story, emotions captured in motion and color, transforming cold financial data into human aspirations. "People don't invest their money with companies, Mr. Cole," she said, her voice soft but intense. "They invest in their dreams, their children's futures, their hopes for a better life. You've built a fortress of numbers, but what people crave is a bridge to possibility." Oliver watched her presentation with growing fascination. Her ideas were bold, innovative, maybe even revolutionary. But there was something else, something in the way she commanded the room, in how her presence seemed to fill the careful empty spaces he'd created with unexpected warmth. "You're suggesting we completely overhaul our marketing strategy," he said finally. "So that's a significant risk." Margaret turned to face him, that subtle smile returning. "Life without risk is just existence, Mr. Cole. Besides," she added, gathering her materials with unhurried confidence, "I thought taking calculated risks was how you built this company in the first place." As she prepared to leave, Oliver found himself doing something unprecedented. "The position," he said, causing her to pause at the door. "It's yours if you want it." Margaret's smile widened slightly. "I'll think about it," she replied, and walked out, leaving behind a faint scent of jasmine and the unsettling feeling that something in Oliver's carefully ordered world had just shifted irreversibly. Later that night, alone in his penthouse apartment, Oliver stood at another wall of windows, looking out over the city lights. His reflection was less perfect now. Tie loosened, hair slightly mussed from running his fingers through it. He'd reviewed Margaret Bennett's references, her work history, her social media presence. Everything checked out, and yet there was something about her he couldn't quite grasp, couldn't categorize or control. It bothered him, like a puzzle piece that refused to fit. But as he sipped his bourbon, he realized something else bothered him more. For the first time in years, he was actually looking forward to tomorrow. His phone buzzed with a message. "Margaret Bennett, I accept the position. When do we begin?" Oliver felt the corner of his mouth lift in an unexpected smile. "Tomorrow," he typed back. 9 a.m. sharp. What he didn't know, couldn't know, was that with those two simple words, he had just set in motion a chain of events that would shatter every wall he'd ever built. The price of control. Chapter 1. The Glass Tower. Oliver Cole stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office, 60 stories above Manhattan, watching his kingdom of glass and steel stretch toward the horizon. The morning sun caught the edges of nearby skyscrapers, creating a fortress of light that matched his mood. Brilliant, sharp, and utterly impenetrable. His reflection stared back at him. Immaculate charcoal suit, platinum watch, not a single dark hair out of place. At 38, he was exactly where he'd planned to be, at the top. Cole Investment Partners had just closed another record quarter, and the Wall Street Journal had named him one of the youngest CEOs to watch. Everything was perfect, controlled, exactly as he'd designed it. The intercom buzzed, breaking his reverie. "Mr. Cole, the marketing consultation interviews are starting in 5 minutes. His assistant's voice was crisp, efficient, just as he'd trained her to be. "Thank you, Rebecca." "I'll be right there." Oliver straightened his already straight tie, a habit born of perfectionism rather than necessity. The conference room was prepared to his exact specifications, water pitchers at precise intervals, leather portfolios aligned at perfect right angles, temperature set at exactly 72 degrees. The candidates would be arriving one by one, each hoping to secure the position of marketing director for Cole Investment Partners. The first 4 interviews went exactly as expected. Qualified candidates, impressive resumes, predictable answers. Oliver made neat notes in his leather-bound notebook, though he'd already dismissed each one. They were good, but good wasn't enough. He needed exceptional. Then Margaret Bennett walked in. She wasn't what he expected. Where the others had been careful, conservative in their corporate attire, she wore a deep burgundy dress that somehow managed to be both professional and striking. Her dark hair fell in soft waves past her shoulders, natural, not styled into submission. But it was her eyes that caught him off guard, green gold and direct, meeting his gaze without a hint of the usual intimidation his presence inspired. "Mr. Cole," she said, extending her hand. Her handshake was firm, confident. "Thank you for considering my application." Oliver gestured to the chair across from him, noting how she moved with an easy grace that seemed to ignore the room's careful formality. She placed her portfolio on the table, slightly askew from the precise angle he'd set. "Your resume is impressive. Ms. Bennett," he began, forcing his attention to the paper in front of him. Though I notice you've moved between several major firms in the past few years. A slight smile played at the corners of her mouth. I go where the challenges are, Mr. Cole. Once I've accomplished what I set out to do, I move on to the next mountain to climb. Some might call that unstable. Some might call it passionate about growth. She leaned forward slightly. I've researched your company extensively, Mr. Cole. You've built something impressive, stable, profitable, respected, but your brand lacks soul. Oliver felt his eyebrows rise. No one spoke to him this directly anymore. Soul isn't quantifiable, Ms. Bennett. Numbers are. That's where you're wrong. She pulled a tablet from her bag, fingers dancing across the screen. May I? Without waiting for his response, she stood and walked to the wall screen, connecting her device. Images began to flow across the display, a marketing campaign she'd developed for a competing firm. But it wasn't just advertisements. It was a story, emotions captured in motion and color, transforming cold financial data into human aspirations. People don't invest their money with companies, Mr. Cole, she said, her voice soft but intense. They invest in their dreams, their children's futures, their hopes for a better life. You've built a fortress of numbers, but what people crave is a bridge to possibility. Oliver watched her presentation with growing fascination. Her ideas were bold, innovative, maybe even revolutionary. But there was something else, something in the way she commanded the room, in how her presence seemed to fill the careful empty spaces he'd created with unexpected warmth. You're suggesting we completely overhaul our marketing strategy, he said finally. So that's a significant risk. Margaret turned to face him, that subtle smile returning. Life without risk is just existence, Mr. Cole. Besides, she added, gathering her materials with unhurried confidence, I thought taking calculated risks was how you built this company in the first place. As she prepared to leave, Oliver found himself doing something unprecedented. The position, he said, causing her to pause at the door. It's yours if you want it. Margaret's smile widened slightly. I'll think about it, she replied, and walked out, leaving behind a faint scent of jasmine and the unsettling feeling that something in Oliver's carefully ordered world had just shifted irreversibly. Later that night, alone in his penthouse apartment, Oliver stood at another wall of windows, looking out over the city lights. His reflection was less perfect now. Tie loosened, hair slightly mussed from running his fingers through it. He'd reviewed Margaret Bennett's references, her work history, her social media presence. Everything checked out, and yet there was something about her he couldn't quite grasp, couldn't categorize or control. It bothered him, like a puzzle piece that refused to fit. But as he sipped his bourbon, he realized something else bothered him more. For the first time in years, he was actually looking forward to tomorrow. His phone buzzed with a message. Margaret Bennett. I accept the position. When do we begin? Oliver felt the corner of his mouth lift in an unexpected smile. Tomorrow, he typed back. Do 9 a.m. sharp. What he didn't know, couldn't know, was that with those two simple words, he had just set in motion a chain of events that would shatter every wall he'd ever built. Chapter 2. Fault Lines. The first crack in Oliver's perfectly constructed world appeared 3 weeks after Margaret started at Cole Investment Partners. It wasn't a dramatic break, just a small fissure in the foundation of his control, so subtle he almost missed it. He was working late, as usual, the office floor dark except for the glow from his corner suite, the city spread out below like a constellation of earthbound stars, a view he'd seen countless times, but rarely truly noticed. Tonight was different. Tonight, he was distracted. Margaret's latest presentation lay open on his tablet, a complete reimagining of how Cole Investment Partners could connect with a new generation of investors. Her ideas were brilliant, unorthodox, and terrifying. They would require him to loosen his grip on every aspect of the company's image, to trust in emotional resonance over cold efficiency. A movement caught his eye, a reflection in the window. Margaret stood in his office doorway, her own tablet in hand. She'd shed her blazer, and the soft light caught the curve of her shoulder, the elegant line of her neck. "You're still here," she said. It wasn't a question. "And as are you," Oliver turned, maintaining his professional distance. "Coming up with more ways to disrupt my company." She smiled, that same enigmatic smile that had been haunting his thoughts. "Your company doesn't need disruption, Mr. Cole. It needs evolution." "Oliver," he found himself saying, "after hours at least, you might as well call me Oliver." Something flickered in her eyes, surprise, perhaps, or something deeper. She moved into the office with that fluid grace that seemed to ignore the conventional boundaries of space and propriety. "Evolution," she continued, perching on the edge of his desk in a way that should have irritated his sense of order, but somehow didn't, "is not about destroying what works. It's about adapting, growing, becoming more than we are. And you think Cole Investment Partners needs to become more than it is?" He moved closer, drawn into her orbit despite his better judgment. "I think," she said softly, "everything and everyone has the potential to be more than they appear." Her eyes met his, and for a moment the carefully maintained distance between them seemed to crackle with unspoken possibility. Oliver felt his pulse quicken. This was dangerous territory. She was his employee, and he never mixed business with pleasure, never allowed emotions to cloud his judgment. Never. "Your latest proposal," he said, forcing his attention back to safer ground. "It's risky. Life is risky." Margaret stood, closing the distance between them slightly. "Tell me something, Oliver. When was the last time you took a risk that wasn't carefully calculated? When was the last time you did something simply because it felt right?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Oliver could smell her perfume, jasmine again, but with something deeper, more complex underneath. Like her. "I should go," she said finally, when he didn't answer. "Early meeting tomorrow." She gathered her things, but paused at the door. "You know what I've noticed about you, Oliver. You've built this amazing tower of success, but you've forgotten to put in any windows." After she left, Oliver stood motionless, her words echoing in his mind. The city lights blurred beyond the glass, and for the first time in years he felt the walls of his carefully constructed world press in around him. His phone buzzed. An email from Margaret. The subject line read, "Because sometimes intuition matters more than analysis." Attached was a revised version of her proposal, somehow even bolder than before. But it wasn't the proposal that caught his attention. It was the personal note at the bottom. "Some risks are worth taking. Dinner tomorrow. No presentations, no proposals. Just conversation." Oliver stared at the message, his finger hovering over the reply button. Every instinct honed over years of careful control told him to decline, to maintain professional boundaries, to stay within the safe confines of his ordered world. Instead, he typed, "Name the place." As he pressed send, he felt another crack form in his perfectly constructed walls. But for the first time in his adult life, the prospect of losing control didn't terrify him. It thrilled him. The restaurant Margaret chose was nothing like the Michelin-starred establishments where Oliver usually conducted business dinners. Tucked away in a quiet corner of the West Village, La Maison Rouge was all warm brick walls and soft candlelight, with worn wooden tables that spoke of history rather than pretense. Oliver arrived precisely on time, as always, but found Margaret already there, seated at a corner table near a window that looked out onto a small courtyard. She'd changed from her work clothes into a simple black dress that made his breath catch slightly. Her hair was loose around her shoulders, catching the candlelight like liquid copper. "You found it," she said, smiling as he approached. "I wasn't sure this would be your kind of place." "It isn't," he admitted, taking his seat. "But that seems to be a pattern with you, pushing me out of my comfort zone. Is that a complaint? An observation?" He studied her across the table, trying to reconcile this version of Margaret with the brilliant strategist who commanded his boardroom. Both seemed equally authentic, yet somehow impossible to fully grasp. The waiter appeared with wine, a bottle Margaret had already ordered. "You'll like this one," she said, as rich burgundy liquid splashed into his glass. "It's unconventional, but sometimes the best things are." Oliver took a sip, surprised by the complex layers of flavor. "You seem to know a lot about wine." "I know a lot about a lot of things." Her eyes met his over the rim of her glass. "But I'm more interested in what you know, Oliver. Outside of business deals and market analysis, there isn't much outside of that," he admitted. "The company is my life." "Is that by choice or by habit?" The question caught him off guard. No one asked him such direct, personal questions anymore. His position usually insulated him from this kind of intimacy. Both, maybe. He found himself wanting to be honest with her. Another unusual sensation. Success requires sacrifice. Does it? Margaret leaned forward slightly. Or is that just what we tell ourselves to justify building walls instead of bridges? Before he could respond, their food arrived. Dishes Margaret had ordered for both of them. Another departure from his usual control. The aromas were intoxicating. "Try it," she encouraged, watching as he regarded the unfamiliar dish. "Trust me." He did, and flavors exploded across his palate. Rich, complex, nothing like his usual carefully measured meals. Like everything about this evening, it was a departure from his norm that somehow felt right. As they ate, conversation flowed more easily than Oliver expected. Margaret drew him out, asking about his childhood. His dreams before success had narrowed his focus to just achievement. He found himself telling her things he'd never shared, about his father's abandonment, his mother's subsequent withdrawal into herself, how he'd learned early that control was the only way to prevent pain. "And now," Margaret asked softly, "has all that control brought you happiness?" "It's brought me success." "That's not what I asked." Oliver studied her face in the candlelight, struck by how she seemed to see right through his carefully constructed facade. "Happiness is subjective," he said finally. "Success is measurable. And yet here you are, having dinner with your marketing director, breaking all your careful rules." Her smile held a challenge. "Why is that, Oliver?" The question hung between them, heavy with possibility. Oliver realized he'd leaned forward, drawn into her space without conscious thought. The candlelight caught the gold flecks in her eyes, making them seem to dance. "Because," he said slowly, "some risks are worth taking." Margaret's smile deepened, a warmth in it that seemed to reach past his defenses. "Now that," she said softly, "sounds like happiness to me." The evening stretched on, their conversation wandering through topics far removed from business. Oliver found himself laughing more than he had in years, fascinated by Margaret's perspectives on everything from art to philosophy. She was brilliant, but not in the calculated way he was used to. Her intelligence was organic, flowing, full of surprising connections and insights. As they walked out into the cool night air, Oliver felt slightly off balance, but in a way that was more exhilarating than uncomfortable. Margaret paused on the sidewalk, looking up at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Thank you for trusting me with this evening," she said. "And thank you for—" he searched for the right words. "Showing me something different." She stepped closer, and for a moment, Oliver thought she might kiss him. Instead, she reached up and straightened his tie, a gesture that felt more intimate than any kiss. "The world's full of different things, Oliver," she murmured. "When you're ready to see them." Before he could respond, she had hailed a cab and was sliding into it, leaving him with the lingering scent of jasmine and the distinct feeling that his carefully ordered world was about to change forever. Later that night, in his penthouse, Oliver stood at his windows again. But for the first time in years, he wasn't seeing the city as a collection of assets and opportunities. He was seeing it as Margaret had described it over dinner, a living tapestry of stories and possibilities. His phone buzzed with a message from her. "Thank you for a lovely evening. Sometimes the best business decisions aren't business decisions at all." Oliver smiled, something tight in his chest loosening. He typed back, "When can we do it again?" Her response came quickly. "Patience, Mr. Cole. Some things can't be controlled or scheduled." They just happen. As he got ready for bed, Oliver realized something that should have terrified him, but didn't. For the first time in his adult life, he was falling into something he couldn't control, and he was falling willingly. The changes in Oliver Cole were subtle at first. A loosened tie here, a spontaneous lunch break there, small cracks in his armor that most people wouldn't notice. But Liam Parker noticed everything about his best friend, and he definitely noticed these. "You seem different," Liam said one morning, lounging in one of the leather chairs in Oliver's office. Through the years of their friendship, he'd earned the right to bypass the usual formalities. More human. Oliver glanced up from his computer, where he'd been reviewing Margaret's latest campaign proposal. "I'm exactly the same." "Really?" Liam raised an eyebrow. "So that wasn't you I saw laughing in the break room yesterday." "Actually laughing, Ollie. Not that careful chuckle you do at board meetings." Before Oliver could respond, a knock at the door interrupted them. Margaret entered, a stack of presentations under her arm. She paused when she saw Liam, that characteristic half-smile playing on her lips. "I can come back," she offered. "No, stay," Liam said, standing. "I was just leaving. But first, dinner this weekend. Both of you. Charlotte's been asking about meeting the woman who's revolutionizing coal investment partners." Oliver felt a familiar tension rise, the instinct to maintain boundaries, keep his professional and personal lives separate. But before he could decline, Margaret spoke. "We'd love to," she said, her eyes meeting Oliver's with a gentle challenge. "Wouldn't we, Oliver?" And just like that, another wall crumbled. After Liam left, Margaret settled into the chair he'd vacated. "He cares about you," she observed. "Real friendship is rare in this world. Liam's known me since college," Oliver admitted. "Before all this," he gestured to the office, "the empire he'd built." "Before the armor?" Margaret's question was soft but direct. She had a way of seeing through him that was both unsettling and exhilarating. Oliver stood, moving to the windows. The morning sun caught the glass of neighboring buildings, creating prisms of light and shadow. Like Margaret herself, moments of brilliant clarity interspersed with mysteries he couldn't penetrate. "Why did you accept the dinner invitation?" he asked, turning to face her. "Because you wouldn't have." She rose, moving to stand beside him. "Because sometimes we need someone to push us past our comfortable boundaries." "Is that what you're doing?" "Pushing my boundaries, among other things." Her hand found his, fingers intertwining naturally. The touch sent electricity through his body. These past few weeks, working together, the dinners, the late-night conversations. "I've seen glimpses of who you are beneath the CEO facade. I'd like to see more." Oliver looked down at their joined hands. "And what if you don't like what you see?" "What if you don't like what you see of me?" she countered. Something flickered in her eyes, a shadow, gone so quickly he might have imagined it. Before he could pursue that thought, his phone buzzed. Another crisis demanding attention, another meeting requiring his presence. The real world intruding on whatever was building between them. "Go," Margaret said, releasing his hand. "Be the CEO. But dinner tonight, that little Italian place in the village." Oliver hesitated only a moment. 8 o'clock. "I'll be there." She gathered her presentations, but paused at the door. "Oh, and Oliver, wear something casual. No armor required." The day passed in a blur of meetings and decisions. But Oliver's thoughts kept returning to Margaret, to the way she challenged him, pushed him, made him question patterns he'd lived by for years. It should have made him uncomfortable. Instead, it made him feel more alive than he had in decades. That evening, as he changed for dinner, Oliver studied his reflection. He'd chosen dark jeans and a cashmere sweater instead of his usual suit, another small rebellion against his own rigid rules. The man in the mirror looked less certain than usual, but somehow more real. His phone chimed with a text from Margaret, running a few minutes late. Had to take care of something unexpected. Oliver frowned at the vague message, an echo of his earlier unease returning. For someone who shared so much of herself in conversation, Margaret could be remarkably opaque about the details of her life outside work. Just then, another text arrived, this one from an unknown number. Ask her about Phoenix. Ask her what really happened. Oliver stared at the message, something cold settling in his stomach, but before he could reply, the text disappeared, as if it had never existed. At the restaurant later, Margaret was radiant in a deep blue dress, her laughter lighting up their corner table. Oliver wanted to ask about the mysterious text, about Phoenix, about all the shadows that seemed to flicker behind her smile. But watching her talk passionately about art and life and possibility, he chose to let it go. Some mysteries, he told himself, were better left unexplored. What he couldn't know, was that this decision would haunt him in the months to come, because sometimes the questions we choose not to ask are the ones whose answers we need most desperately. As they walked along the village streets after dinner, Margaret slipped her hand into his again. The night was cool, the streets quiet. For a moment, everything felt perfect. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" "For letting your guard down. For being here, like this, with me." Oliver pulled her closer, breathing in her familiar jasmine scent. "I'm beginning to think I never had a choice. Not from the moment you walked into my office." Margaret's smile held a trace of sadness he didn't understand. "We always have choices, Oliver. Sometimes we just don't see them until it's too late." Later that night, alone in his penthouse, Oliver found himself looking at his phone, searching for the mysterious text about Phoenix. But it was gone, leaving him with nothing but questions and the lingering scent of jasmine on his sweater. In the darkness, he made a decision. Tomorrow, he would ask Margaret about Phoenix. Tomorrow, he would unravel the mystery. But tomorrow, as it turned out, would bring its own complications, and the questions would remain unasked for just a little longer. The first sign that something was wrong came in the form of a manila envelope on Oliver's desk. No return address, no markings, just his name typed in clean, impersonal letters. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a police report from Phoenix, Arizona, dated 3 years ago. The name on the report had been redacted, but the details made his blood run cold. A fraud investigation, missing funds, a suspect who vanished before questioning. Oliver stared at the document, his coffee growing cold beside him. The morning sun painted harsh shadows across his desk, turning the paper in his hands into a roadmap of questions he wasn't sure he wanted answered. "Your 9 a.m. is here." Rebecca's voice crackled through the intercom, startling him. He quickly slipped the report into his desk drawer. Send them in. But it wasn't his 9 a.m. who walked through the door. It was Margaret. She wore a cream-colored suit that should have looked pristine, but something about her seemed slightly disheveled, as if she'd been up all night. "Can we talk?" she asked, closing the door behind her. Oliver felt the weight of the police report in his drawer, like a physical presence between them. "Of course." Margaret moved to the windows, her back to him. "I need to take a few days off. Something's come up, a family emergency. Is everything all right?" She turned, and for a moment he caught something in her expression he'd never seen before. Fear. "Just some loose ends I need to tie up. I'll be back by Monday." Oliver stood, moving toward her. "Margaret, if you're in some kind of trouble." "I'm not." The response came too quickly, too sharply. She softened it with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Really, it's nothing. Just some family business in Chicago." Chicago, not Phoenix. The lie hung between them like smoke. "Let me help," he said, reaching for her hand. "Whatever it is, you can't." She pulled away, but not before he felt the slight tremor in her fingers. Some things we have to face alone. The distance between them, physical and emotional, felt suddenly vast. Oliver thought about the report in his drawer, the questions multiplying in his mind, but looking at her now, seeing the barely contained desperation behind her calm facade, he couldn't bring himself to confront her. "When do you leave?" "This afternoon." She moved to the door, then paused. "Oliver, thank you." "For what?" "For not asking questions I can't answer. Not yet." After she left, Oliver sat at his desk for a long time, staring at nothing. Finally, he pulled out his phone and did something he'd never done before. He called in a favor from a less than legitimate source. "I need everything you can find on Margaret Bennett," he told the man on the other end. "Especially anything connected to Phoenix." "Could take a few days," the voice replied, "and it won't be cheap. Money's not an issue. Just be discreet." That evening, Oliver found himself in front of Margaret's apartment building in the West Village. The street was quiet, brownstones glowing warmly in the twilight. Her light was on, shadows moving behind drawn curtains. He watched as a taxi pulled up, as Margaret emerged with a single small suitcase. Even from a distance, he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she kept glancing over her shoulder as she got into the car. His phone buzzed. Another text from the unknown number. "You're not the first one she's fooled. Ask about Richard Kane." Oliver's finger hovered over Margaret's number. One call, and he could demand answers. One call, and the careful dance they'd been doing would end. Instead, he watched her taxi disappear into the Manhattan traffic, taking its secrets with it. Back in his office, Oliver did something he hadn't done in years. He poured himself a drink before sunset. The bourbon burned going down, but it did nothing to ease the knot in his stomach. He found himself looking through photos from the past few months. Margaret laughing at company events, Margaret intense in meetings, Margaret soft and mysterious in candlelight. In each image, she seemed simultaneously present and elsewhere, as if part of her was always preparing to vanish. His computer chimed with an email from his investigator. First results coming in. "It's complicated. She's not who you think she is." Oliver closed the email without opening the attachments. Outside his window, the city lights blurred into a constellation of uncertainty. Everything he'd built his life around, control, order, predictability, seemed to be slipping through his fingers. His phone lit up with a message from Margaret. "I'm sorry I had to leave like this. Trust that everything I feel for you is real." Trust. The word echoed in his mind like a challenge. Trust was a luxury he'd never allowed himself, a risk he'd never been willing to take, until her. He typed back, "Come back to me." The response came hours later, when the city was quiet and his office was dark except for the glow of his phone. "Some things are better left in the past, but I'll try." Oliver stood at his windows, watching the city below. Somewhere out there, Margaret was running from something, or someone. And for the first time in his life, he was considering running after someone instead of away. The police report sat heavy in his briefcase, a reminder that sometimes the truth is a double-edged sword. But as he finally headed home in the early hours of the morning, Oliver made a decision. Whatever Margaret was hiding, whatever storm was coming, he would face it with her. What he didn't realize was that storms have a way of destroying everything in their path, especially the things we hold most dear. 5 days. Margaret had been gone for 5 days, and Oliver's carefully ordered world was unraveling one thread at a time. The attachment from his investigator remained unopened in his inbox, a digital Pandora's box he both dreaded and longed to open. "You look like hell," Liam said, letting himself into Oliver's office early Monday morning. He carried 2 cups of coffee, real coffee from the Italian place down the street, not the executive lounge's precise but soulless brew. Oliver accepted the cup without comment. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, his usually immaculate suit slightly rumpled. He'd spent the weekend alternating between staring at his phone and pacing his penthouse, waiting for messages that never came. "Have you slept at all?" Liam settled into his usual chair, concern etching his features. "Duh, I've been busy." "Busy obsessing, you mean?" Liam leaned forward. "Talk to me, Ollie. What's really going on?" Instead of answering, Oliver pulled the Phoenix police report from his desk drawer and handed it to his friend. Liam read it slowly, his expression darkening. "Where did you get this?" "It was sent to me, anonymously." Oliver ran a hand through his disheveled hair. "And there's more. A name, Richard Kane. Someone's trying to tell me something about Margaret, but I can't." "Open it," Liam said quietly. "What?" The investigators report. I know you hired someone. You've got that guilty look you always get when you do something you think I'll disapprove of. Whatever's in that email, it can't be worse than what you're imagining. Oliver stared at his computer screen, at the unopened email that promised answers. With a deep breath, he clicked. The information spilled across his screen like a digital tsunami. Margaret Bennett wasn't Margaret Bennett at all. 3 years ago, she was Catherine Walsh, working at a private equity firm in Phoenix. Before that, she was Elizabeth Carter in Seattle. Different names, different lives, but always the same pattern. She would rise quickly in prestigious firms, gain trust and access, and then $2 million. Oliver read aloud, his voice hollow. Missing from client accounts in Phoenix, another $3 million in Seattle, all traced back to her, but she vanished before she could be questioned. Ollie? Liam's voice was gentle. There's more. Oliver scrolled through the documents, each revelation a fresh wound. Richard Kane was her supervisor in Phoenix. They were romantically involved. When the fraud was discovered, he took the fall. Served 18 months while she disappeared with the money. The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Outside, storm clouds gathered over Manhattan, as if nature itself was reflecting Oliver's darkening mood. "What are you going to do?" Liam finally asked. Before Oliver could answer, his phone lit up with a message. "Margaret, landing at JFK in an hour. Can we talk?" Oliver stared at the message, his heart pounding. Everything in him screamed to call the authorities, to end this before it went any further. But another part, the part that remembered her laugh, her touch, the way she saw through his carefully constructed walls, hesitated. "I need to know why," he said finally. "Oliver, I need to hear it from her." He stood, straightening his tie with trembling fingers. "I need to understand." Liam rose too, placing a hand on his friend's shoulder. "Just be careful. People like that, they're artists at manipulation. Don't let your feelings cloud your judgment." But it was too late for that. Oliver's judgment had been clouded from the moment Margaret, or whatever her real name was, walked into his life. An hour later, he stood in the private lounge at JFK, watching through floor-to-ceiling windows as her plane taxied to the gate. Rain pelted the glass, distorting the world outside into an impressionist painting of greys and silvers. She appeared through the jet bridge, smaller somehow than he remembered. Her face lit up when she saw him, but the smile faded as she drew closer and saw his expression. "You know," she said quietly, "it wasn't a question. Not everything." Oliver's voice was carefully controlled. "But enough." Margaret, Catherine, Elizabeth, whoever she was, sank into one of the lounge's leather chairs. For a long moment, she said nothing, just stared out at the rain-swept tarmac. "I never meant to fall in love with you," she finally said. "That wasn't part of the plan." "Was there a plan?" The words came out sharper than he intended. "Was any of it real?" She turned to him then, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "All of it. That's what makes this so impossible. Tell me about Richard Kane." The color drained from her face. "And where did you hear that name? Does it matter?" Oliver moved closer, his need for answers overwhelming his instinct to maintain distance. "Tell me the truth. For once, just tell me the truth." Margaret stood abruptly, pacing the empty lounge. "The truth," she laughed, but there was no humor in it. "The truth is, I'm running. I've been running for so long I sometimes forget who I really am. Richard. He wasn't supposed to take the fall. He was supposed to run with me. With the money you stole. The money I took back," she corrected, her voice hardening. "From men who stole it first, who ruined lives with their greed and called it business." She stopped pacing, facing him directly. "Men like Richard. Men like I thought you were." The implication hit Oliver like a physical blow. "Is that what I am to you? Another mark?" "No." The force of her denial echoed through the empty lounge. "That's what I'm trying to tell you. You were supposed to be. But then I got to know you. The real you, behind all that careful control. And for the first time, I wanted to stop running. Outside, lightning split the sky, illuminating her face in harsh white light. In that flash, Oliver saw something in her eyes he recognized, the same loneliness, the same fear of vulnerability that had driven him to build his own walls. "Why did you come back?" he asked softly. Margaret moved closer, close enough that he could smell her familiar jasmine scent. "Because running from you would be harder than facing whatever comes next." "And what comes next?" She reached up, touching his face with trembling fingers. "That depends on you. Richard's out of prison. He's looking for me, for the money. That's why I had to leave last week. To move it, to protect it." "To protect yourself," Oliver corrected. "To protect both of us." She let her hand fall. "I should go. You know enough now to destroy me. I wouldn't blame you if you did." Oliver caught her wrist as she turned to leave. "Wait." The word hung between them, heavy with possibility and danger. In that moment, Oliver knew he stood at a crossroads. One path led back to his safe, controlled world. The other. "Tell me everything," he said. "No more secrets, no more lies." Margaret's eyes searched his face. "If I do, there's no going back. You'll be part of this." "I'm already part of this." He pulled her closer. "I was part of this the moment you walked into my office." As the storm raged outside, Margaret began to talk, and with each word, Oliver felt his world shifting, transforming into something he never could have predicted or controlled. But some transformations, once begun, cannot be stopped, and some storms must be weathered, no matter the cost. The morning after Margaret's confession, Oliver sat in his office, watching the sunrise paint Manhattan in shades of gold. He hadn't slept. Her words still echoed in his mind, each revelation another crack in the foundation of his carefully constructed life. The money wasn't just stolen, it was evidence. Years of corporate fraud, insider trading, pension theft, all meticulously documented. Margaret had been a whistleblower once, trying to do things the right way. But when the system protected the corrupt and punished the honest, she'd chosen a different path. "You're going to protect her." Liam's voice from the doorway wasn't questioning. He knew his friend too well. Oliver didn't turn from the window. "She's not what we thought." "No." Liam moved into the office, closing the door. "She's more dangerous than we thought." Now Oliver did turn, facing his oldest friend. The morning light cast harsh shadows across his unmade face, highlighting the cost of his sleepless night. "What would you have done if it was Charlotte? If you discovered everything you thought you knew was wrong, but what you felt was real?" Liam sank into his usual chair, running a hand through his graying hair. "I'd like to think I'd do the right thing." "The right thing," Oliver repeated softly. When did that become so unclear? A knock interrupted them. Rebecca, looking uncomfortable. "Mr. Cole, the board is requesting an emergency meeting. Something about irregularities in recent financial reports." Oliver felt his stomach drop. He knew, even before he opened his email, what he would find. The message was from an anonymous account. Photographs of Margaret as Catherine Walsh with Richard Kane. Documents linking her to the Phoenix scandal, all sent to every board member. "When's the meeting?" "They're assembling now." After Rebecca left, Liam stood. "This is it, isn't it? The moment you choose." Oliver straightened his tie, muscle memory taking over as his mind raced. There was never really a choice." "There's always a choice, Ollie." "Not for me." Oliver gathered his tablet and phone. "Not anymore." The boardroom was silent when he entered, 12 pairs of eyes watching him take his seat. William Dresden, the head of the board, spoke first. "Care to explain these, Oliver?" He gestured to the documents displayed on the room's screens. "Or should we ask Ms. Bennett? Though I suppose that's not her real name." Oliver looked at the evidence against Margaret, against their future, and made a decision that would change everything. "Margaret Bennett is an undercover investigator," he said, his voice steady despite the lie, "working with federal authorities to track a sophisticated financial fraud scheme. Her cover identity was essential to the operation." The room erupted in murmurs. Dresden's eyes narrowed. "Us, and you're just telling us this now?" I was bound by confidentiality, but given these leaks, which presumably come from the targets of the investigation, I'm authorized to disclose certain details. Oliver felt Liam's eyes on him, felt the weight of each lie as he spun a tale of corporate espionage and heroic undercover work. It was the performance of his life, and it was working. He could see the board members, expressions shifting from suspicion to intrigue. The individual behind these leaks, Oliver continued, is Richard Kane, a convicted fraudster seeking revenge. By discrediting Ms. Bennett, he hopes to disrupt the investigation and protect his co-conspirators. And you can verify this, Dresden pressed. Call the FBI's white-collar division, ask for Agent Wilson. Oliver met Dresden's gaze steadily, praying Margaret's connections were as good as she claimed. And he'll confirm everything. Later, after the board dispersed, suspicious but temporarily appeased, Oliver found himself alone in his office with Liam. Agent Wilson doesn't exist, does he? He will by the time they make that call. Oliver loosened his tie, suddenly exhausted. Margaret has resources. Do you realize what you've done? Liam's voice was quiet. You just committed perjury to protect a thief. I committed perjury to protect the truth. Oliver turned to his friend. The money she took. It's documented evidence of crimes that dwarf anything she's done. Corporate theft, pension fraud, market manipulation, all of it protected by people with enough power to bury any official investigation. So that makes it right, Liam challenged. Stealing from thieves is still stealing, Ollie. Maybe, Oliver sank into his chair, or maybe sometimes you have to break the rules to serve justice. His phone buzzed. Margaret, Kane's in New York. He knows. Oliver's hands tightened on the phone. How much time? Her response was immediate. Not much. We need to move everything, tonight. Everything you just told the board, Liam said, watching his friend's face. You're going to help her, aren't you? Actually help her hide stolen money. Evidence, Oliver corrected. And yes, because it's the right thing to do. Liam stood, conflict clear on his face. The right thing, he echoed. Then, after a long moment, what do you need? Oliver looked up, surprised. You'll help. I'll help you, Liam clarified, because you're my friend, and because I know that look. You're going to do this with or without me, so he shrugged. Better with. As the day faded into evening, Oliver prepared for a night that would change everything. He arranged transfers, created false trails, utilized every skill he'd learned, building his empire to help hide Margaret's evidence. What he didn't know, couldn't know, was that Richard Kane was closer than any of them realized. And he wasn't just after the money anymore. He wanted revenge. The New York night was alive with possibilities and danger as Oliver's town car slid through the rain-slicked streets. Margaret sat beside him, her laptop casting a blue glow across her face as her fingers danced across the keyboard. In the front seat, Liam kept checking the rear-view mirror, watching for signs of pursuit. How much longer? Oliver asked, watching Margaret work. Almost there. The transfers have to be perfect, untraceable. She paused, glancing up at him. You can still walk away from this, Oliver. Go back to your life, your empire. Tell the board you were deceived. Oliver reached over, closing her laptop. Stop. We're past that point. Their eyes met in the dim light of the car. So much had changed since that first meeting in his office, yet something fundamental remained the same. The electricity between them, the sense that they were two pieces of a puzzle finally finding their fit. The next transfer point is coming up, Liam called from the front. You sure about this location? Margaret nodded. The cafe has the strongest encrypted Wi-Fi in the city. Owner's an old friend. He doesn't ask questions. The cafe was a small place tucked between a bookstore and a vintage clothing shop in the West Village. At midnight, it should have been closed, but a single light burned in the window. As they approached, Oliver noticed a man watching them from across the street. We're being followed, he said quietly. Margaret's hand tightened on her laptop. Kane! No. Oliver recognized the man's stance, his careful observation. Private security, board, must have hired them. We need to move faster, Liam urged. If they're watching you, Kane won't be far behind. Inside the cafe, the owner, a bearded man who introduced himself only as Ray, led them to a back room filled with vintage computer equipment. Margaret immediately set up her laptop, connecting to multiple networks simultaneously. "This will take about 20 minutes, she said, fingers flying across the keyboard. "The evidence needs to be secured, where Kane can't reach it, but where we can still access it if needed." Oliver watched her work, marveling at how different she seemed in this element. Focused, precise, a digital Robin Hood in designer clothes. He found himself wondering which version of her was real, the brilliant marketing executive or the skilled hacker. Perhaps they both were. A text from Rebecca broke his reverie. "Mr. Dresden called. They know about the cafe." "Police en route. We need to go," Oliver announced. "Now." "2 more minutes," Margaret pleaded. The final transfer. The cafe's front window shattered. A canister rolled across the floor, spewing smoke. Through the chaos, Oliver heard Liam shouting, felt Margaret's hand grab his. They ran through the back door into a maze of alleyways. "This way," Margaret pulled him left, then right, through passages that seemed to fold in on themselves. Behind them, footsteps echoed off brick walls. They emerged onto a wider street, but before they could decide which way to run, a black SUV screeched to a halt in front of them. The passenger window rolled down. Richard Kane smiled from behind the glass. He looked exactly like his photos, handsome in a cruel way, with eyes that held no warmth. "Hello, Catherine. Or is it Margaret now?" Oliver stepped in front of Margaret protectively, but Kane just laughed. "How noble. She's got you completely fooled, hasn't she?" Kane's smile widened. "Did she tell you about Phoenix? About how she set me up? About the real reason she takes the money?" "I know enough," Oliver replied coldly. "No." Kane's expression hardened. "You don't know anything, but you will." He raised something that glinted in the streetlight, a gun. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Margaret shoved Oliver aside as the shot rang out. He felt the bullet whiz past his ear. Then Liam was there, ramming their town car into Kane's SUV. In the confusion, Margaret grabbed Oliver's hand again, and they ran. They didn't stop running until they reached a safe house Margaret had prepared, a small apartment above a Chinese restaurant in Chinatown. Only then did Oliver notice the blood on Margaret's sleeve. "You're hurt," he said, reaching for her. "It's just a graze." She pulled away, moving to the window to check the street below. "Kane will be back. He won't stop until he gets what he wants." "Which is what?" Oliver demanded. "The truth, Margaret, all of it. What does he really want?" She turned to face him, and in her eyes he saw a depth of pain he hadn't expected. "Revenge. Not for the money. That was never really his. For what I made him lose." Which was? His reputation, his freedom, his love. She sank onto a worn couch. "I loved him once, Oliver, before I knew what he really was, before I discovered what he and his partners were doing to people's lives with their schemes." Oliver sat beside her, careful not to touch her injured arm. "So you turned on him?" "I tried to stop him legally first, went to the SEC, the FBI, but his connections were too strong. So I gathered evidence, planned to expose everything." Her voice hardened. "But he found out, tried to kill me. That's when I decided if I couldn't stop him legally, I'd destroy him another way, by stealing the money, by stealing the evidence," she corrected. "The money is just proof of their crimes, every transaction, every fraud, every life they ruined. It's all documented. That's what Kane really wants to destroy." Oliver absorbed this, thinking of the lies he'd told the board, the laws he'd broken tonight. Was any of this worth it? Margaret reached for his hand, intertwining their fingers. "Ask the thousands of people whose pensions they stole. Ask the families they bankrupted." She squeezed his hand. "Ask yourself if knowing the truth about me was worth losing your perfect world." Before he could answer, both their phones buzzed simultaneously. A message from Liam. Kane's men found the cafe owner. He talked. "They're coming." Margaret stood, moving quickly to retrieve a go-bag from under a floorboard. "We need to move. I have one more safe house." "No," Oliver caught her arm. My penthouse. It's the last place they'd look, and I have security they can't breach. Oliver, trust me, he said, like I'm trusting you. For a moment, she hesitated. Then, slowly, she nodded. As they made their way through the pre-dawn streets, Oliver felt the weight of every decision that had led to this moment. His ordered world had dissolved into chaos, yet somehow he felt more alive than ever before. What he didn't realize was that the real chaos was still to come, because even as they headed for the sanctuary of his penthouse, forces were gathering that would tear their world apart. And trust, no matter how strong, might not be enough to save them. Oliver's penthouse felt different in the grey light of dawn. The floor-to-ceiling windows that had once represented his mastery over Manhattan now felt exposing, as if the entire city could witness their desperation. Margaret stood at those windows, her silhouette a dark slash against the lightening sky, while Oliver made calls that would either save or destroy them both. The boards called another emergency meeting, he said, ending his last call. Dresden's pushing for an immediate vote of no confidence. Margaret didn't turn from the window. You're going to lose everything because of me. I lost everything the moment I met you. Oliver moved to stand behind her, close enough to catch her familiar jasmine scent mixed with something else now. Fear, perhaps, or resignation. Or maybe that's when I finally found everything. She turned then, and he saw the tears she was fighting to hold back. Don't make this harder than it has to be. Make what harder? Before she could answer, his private elevator hummed to life. They both tensed, but it was only Liam, looking exhausted and grim. Kane's got people watching the building, he reported, dropping into a leather armchair. And that's not the worst of it. The FBI's involved now. Real FBI, not our fake agent. Someone sent them everything about Phoenix. Margaret's face went pale. Everything? Enough to make them very interested in finding you. Liam pulled out his phone, showing them a news alert. It's going public. The whole story, the fraud, the theft, all of it. Kane's spinning it his way, painting himself as the whistleblower who tried to stop you. That bastard, Margaret whispered. He's burning everything down to save himself. Oliver watched her pace the room, noting how her composed facade was beginning to crack. For the first time, he saw real fear in her eyes. We can fight this, he said. I have connections, resources. No! Margaret's voice was sharp. You don't understand. Kane's not just trying to discredit me. He's trying to force me out into the open. He knows. She stopped abruptly, but Oliver caught the slip. Knows what? Margaret sank onto his white leather couch, suddenly looking very small and very tired. There's something I haven't told you. Something I've never told anyone. Liam stood quietly. I'll give you two some privacy. After he left, Oliver sat beside Margaret, close but not touching, waiting. The money from Phoenix, she began slowly, wasn't the only thing I took. I found something in Kane's private files, proof of something much bigger, a conspiracy involving judges, FBI agents, even senators. The kind of proof that gets people killed. That's why you've been running all this time, she nodded. Kane knows I have it, hidden somewhere. That's what he really wants. The money, that's just a cover. This evidence, it could bring down dozens of powerful people, including him. Then let's use it, Oliver urged. Release it all, bring them down. It's not that simple. Margaret stood, resuming her restless pacing. These people, they don't just kill their enemies, they destroy everything and everyone their enemies care about first. The implication hung heavy in the morning air. Oliver felt something cold settle in his stomach as he understood what she wasn't saying. You're planning to disappear again. I have to. She turned to him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. As long as I'm here, you're in danger. Your company, your life, everything you've built. I won't let them destroy you because of me. Oliver crossed to her in 2 quick strides, catching her arms. You don't get to make that decision for me. Yes, I do. She touched his face gently. Because I love you, and sometimes love means letting go. The words hung between them, The first time either had said it, Oliver pulled her closer, kissing her with all the desperation and fear and love he'd been holding back. She responded with equal intensity, as if trying to memorize the feel of him. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Oliver pressed his forehead to hers. "Stay. We'll face it together. Whatever Kane throws at us." A sharp crack split the air. One of the floor-to-ceiling windows spider-webbed, a bullet hole at its center. Oliver tackled Margaret to the ground as more shots followed. Glass rained down around them as they crawled behind the kitchen island. "You still want me to stay?" Margaret's laugh was bitter. "This is what loving me gets you, Oliver. Bullets through your windows and your life in ruins." Before he could respond, both their phones buzzed. A message from an unknown number, accompanied by a photo of Oliver's sister, Vanessa, leaving her apartment. "Time's up, Catherine. Come alone to the old Phoenix building by midnight, or your new love loses someone just like I did. And this time, it really will be your fault." Margaret's face went ash white. She looked at Oliver, and he saw in her eyes a decision already made. "Don't," he started to say, but she was already moving, quick as a shadow, toward the emergency stairs. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Remember me as Margaret." That part, at least, was real. Then she was gone, leaving Oliver amid the shattered glass of his perfect world, knowing that by midnight he would lose her forever, unless he could find a way to stop her first. The Phoenix building stood like a steel and glass tombstone against the midnight sky, its abandoned floors dark except for a single light burning on the top floor. Oliver sat in his car across the street, watching, his hand tight on his phone. The screen showed his last message to Margaret, sent an hour ago. "Whatever you're planning, don't. Please." She hadn't responded. "You shouldn't be here," Liam said from the passenger seat. "If Kane's people spot you." "They already have." Oliver nodded toward a black SUV idling at the corner. "They're waiting to see what we do." After Margaret had fled the penthouse, Oliver had moved quickly. First, ensuring Vanessa was safe. She was now in a private security facility upstate. Then, calling in every favor he had left to track Margaret's movements. But she was too good, too experienced at disappearing, until now. "She wants to be found," Oliver said, more to himself than Liam. "She's ending it here, where it all began." His phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number. "Watching you won't save her, Mr. Cole. Some stories only end one way." Oliver deleted Kane's message without responding. He checked his watch, 11:45 p.m. Time was running out. "Walk me through it again," Liam said. "The evidence she took from Kane is hidden somewhere in the building's old servers." Oliver had pieced it together from fragments of conversations, from the things Margaret had let slip. Kane's original office was here, before Phoenix, before everything fell apart. She hid it where it all started. "And you think she's going to trade herself for the evidence, for Vanessa's safety?" Oliver's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "She thinks it's the only way to end this." "Maybe she's right." Liam's voice was gentle. "Some battles can't be won, Ollie. This isn't about winning." Oliver turned to his friend. This is about not letting someone you love sacrifice themselves because they think they have to face everything alone." Liam studied him for a long moment. "You really do love her. Enough to stop her from making this mistake." Movement caught their attention, a figure slipping through the building's side entrance. Even from a distance, Oliver would know Margaret anywhere. "Now or never," he muttered, reaching for the door. Liam caught his arm. "Wait. You need to understand something. If you go in there, there's no coming back. Your career, your reputation, already gone." Oliver managed a tight smile. "The board voted this afternoon. I'm no longer CEO of Cole Investment Partners." "What? Why didn't you tell me?" "Because it doesn't matter." Oliver checked his watch again. 11:50 p.m. Nothing matters except getting to her before Kane does. The next few minutes were a blur of careful movement through dark corridors. Oliver had memorized the building's layout, and Liam had managed to hack into the old security system. They avoided Kane's men on the lower floors, making their way steadily up. At 11:57, they reached the server room on the top floor. Voices echoed from inside, Margaret's and Kane's. "All here," Margaret was saying. "Every transaction, every bribe, every murder, ready to be released to every major news outlet. Unless," Kane's voice was surprisingly soft, "unless you let them go. Oliver, his sister, everyone. Let them live their lives. I'll disappear. Take the blame for everything. You'll have your revenge." "Oh, Catherine," Kane's laugh was chilling. "You still don't understand. This was never about revenge. This was about power, control. The same things you fell in love with in both of us." Oliver tensed, ready to move, but Liam held him back. Through the gap in the door, they could see Margaret standing proud despite her fear, facing Kane across a bank of old servers. "You're wrong," Margaret said. "What I feel for Oliver, it's nothing like what I felt for you. He showed me there's more to life than power games and control. And look what it got you." Kane moved closer to her. "Trapped, alone, about to die in the same room where you first betrayed me. I'm not alone." Margaret's voice carried absolute certainty. "And I'm not the one who's trapped." She pressed something on her phone. Suddenly, every screen in the room lit up, displaying documents, photos, videos, the evidence she'd hidden. But it wasn't just displaying locally. Oliver could see upload progress bars, dozens of them, showing the data spreading across the internet. Kane's face contorted with rage. "Stop it!" "Can't." Margaret's smile was fierce. "Dead man's switch. The moment my heart stops, everything releases. Full distribution. You shoot me. You destroy everything you've tried to protect. Then I'll just have to make you stop it yourself." Kane raised his gun, but not at Margaret. He turned toward the door. "Come on out, Mr. Cole. I know you're there. Let's see how long Catherine's principles last when I start shooting the people she loves." Oliver felt Liam tense beside him, ready to act. But this was his moment, his chance to prove to Margaret that she didn't have to face everything alone. He stepped through the door. "Hello, Richard," he said calmly. "I believe we have some things to discuss." Margaret's face showed a flash of fear before her mask slipped back into place. But Oliver caught her eye, gave her the slightest nod, a signal, a promise. Whatever came next, they would face it together, because some battles, he realized, aren't about winning or losing. They're about showing someone that love is stronger than fear, that trust matters more than control, that no one has to stand alone in the darkness, even if that darkness holds a gun. Time seemed to crystallize in the server room, each second stretching like glass about to shatter. Kane's gun moved between Oliver and Margaret, his composed facade cracking around the edges. "Noble of you to join us, Mr. Cole," Kane said, his voice carrying a tremor of barely controlled rage. "Though I have to admit, I expected you sooner. Had to make sure my sister was safe first." Oliver kept his voice steady, moving slowly to position himself between Kane and Margaret. "Something about a man who threatens women to feel powerful. I just couldn't take the risk." Kane's laugh was harsh. "Protecting her already. You don't even know who she really is." "I know exactly who she is." Oliver didn't look at Margaret, but he could feel her presence behind him, electric and alive. "She's the woman who made me realize that all my control, all my careful plans, were just walls I built to avoid really living." "How touching." Kane's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Tell me, does it bother you, knowing you're just the latest mark? That everything, every smile, every touch, every whispered confession was just another con?" "You're wrong." Margaret's voice was soft but firm. "Oliver was never a mark. He was the mistake I never saw coming, the one person who made me want to stop running." "Then stop." Kane's gun steadied on Oliver's chest. "Stop the uploads. Come with me. Or watch him die knowing it was your choice that killed him." Oliver felt Margaret step forward, but he held out his arm, keeping her behind him. "You're not thinking this through, Richard. Kill me, and the evidence still releases. Kill her. Same result. You've lost." "Have I?" Kane's eyes glittered with malice. "What about your friend in the hallway, the one who helped you get up here?" Oliver's blood ran cold. Through the open door, he could see Liam being marched in at gunpoint by one of Kane's men. "Sorry, Ollie," Liam said, his face bloody but defiant. "Bastard had backup on the stairs." Kane gestured with his gun. "Now then, 3 lives in your hands, Catherine. Or should I start calling you Margaret? That's the name you chose when you fell in love this time, isn't it?" Oliver watched Margaret's reflection in one of the dark server screens. She stood perfectly still, but he could see the calculations running behind her eyes. Whatever she was planning, he had to buy her time. "You know what your mistake was, Richard." Oliver kept his voice conversational, drawing Kane's attention. "You never understood her at all. You thought she was like you, obsessed with power, with control, but she's something else entirely. Something you could never be." "And what's that?" "Free." Oliver smiled, and in the server screen he saw Margaret begin to move. "While you were building cages, she was learning to fly." Several things happened at once. Margaret's phone lit up with a sequence of commands. The servers around them hummed to life, screens flickering with data, and through the window behind Kane, a bright light suddenly blazed. A police helicopter, its spotlight flooding the room. Kane spun toward the window, momentarily blinded. Margaret launched herself at his gun hand, while Oliver tackled him from the front. The gun went off, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. Oliver felt a searing pain in his shoulder, but kept his grip on Kane. "FBI, freeze!" Agents poured through the door, weapons drawn. Kane's backup man was already on the ground, Liam standing over him with a bloody grin. "You played me!" Kane spat as agents cuffed him. In the whole thing, the uploads, the dead man's switch, it was all a distraction. "No," Margaret said, helping Oliver to his feet. "The evidence is still uploading. But unlike you, Richard, I learned that sometimes the best way to win is to trust someone else to help you fight." Oliver leaned against her, his shoulder bleeding but his heart lighter than it had been in weeks. "It's over," he whispered. Margaret's expression changed, a shadow crossing her face. "Not quite." Before he could react, she pressed something into his hand, a small USB drive and a note. Then she kissed him, fierce and desperate. "I'm sorry," she breathed against his lips. "But there's one more thing I have to do." "Margaret, don't!" But she was already moving, slipping through the chaos of FBI agents and crime scene techs. Oliver tried to follow, but his injured shoulder sent waves of dizziness through him. By the time Liam reached his side, Margaret was gone. "Let me see that shoulder," Liam said, but Oliver was already reading the note. "My love, the drive contains everything, the evidence, the names, the truth. Kane wasn't working alone. There are others, higher up, who will come for us now. I have to lead them away from you. I wish we had more time. I wish I could be the woman you deserve, someone who could stay, who could build a life in the light with you. But I've lived in shadows too long. Know that everything I felt was real, that you taught me what love truly means. Not possession, not control, but the courage to let go to protect what matters most. Don't look for me. Live your life. Be happy. And remember, sometimes the greatest act of love is walking away. M. Oliver clutched the note, his shoulder forgotten in the face of this new pain. Outside, the helicopter's spotlight swept the surrounding buildings, searching, but he knew they wouldn't find her. Margaret had spent a lifetime learning to disappear. The sun was rising over Manhattan by the time the FBI finished processing the scene. Oliver sat in an ambulance, his shoulder bandaged, watching Kane being led away. The evidence was already making headlines, senators resigning, judges being arrested, a web of corruption unraveling in the morning light. "She'll come back," Liam said, sitting beside him. "When it's safe." Oliver touched the note in his pocket, feeling the weight of Margaret's last words. No, she won't. Because he finally understood. Sometimes love wasn't about holding on. Sometimes it was about being strong enough to let go, even if letting go felt like falling. 6 months after Margaret disappeared, Oliver stood at the windows of his new office, watching autumn paint Central Park in shades of gold and crimson. The space was smaller than his old CEO suite, but somehow it felt more real, more alive. The headlines had faded. Kane's conviction, along with those of 3 senators and a federal judge, had sparked reforms that were still rippling through the financial world. Oliver's own testimony, carefully worded to protect Margaret, had helped rebuild some of his reputation. Enough that he'd been able to start over, founding a smaller firm focused on ethical investment and corporate accountability. "Your 10 o'clock is here," his new assistant announced through the intercom. "Send them in." Oliver turned from the window, adjusting his tie, a habit he'd never quite broken. The man who entered was elderly, distinguished, carrying a thin manila envelope. "Mr. Cole, I represent the Barrett Foundation." The man settled into a chair. "We are interested in your firm's approach to ethical investing." Oliver sat behind his desk, noting how the morning light caught the edges of the envelope. "I wasn't aware the Barrett Foundation was looking for new management." "We weren't." The man smiled slightly. "Until a very persuasive consultant recommended you." "Specifically?" Oliver's heart skipped. "This consultant, did she have green gold eyes?" "I wouldn't know." The man placed the envelope on the desk. "She made her recommendation remotely, but she did ask me to deliver this, personally." After the man left, Oliver sat for a long time staring at the envelope. Finally, with slightly trembling fingers, he opened it. Inside was a single photograph. Margaret, her hair shorter now, standing on a beach at sunset. She was laughing at something off-camera, looking more relaxed than he'd ever seen her. On the back, in her familiar handwriting, "Some cages we build ourselves. Thank you for teaching me how to be free. I'm safe. I'm happy. I'm helping people in my own way now. The foundation is legitimate. They need someone like you. Someone who understands that real power comes from making the world better, not from controlling it. Love always finds its way home. M.P.S. Look up." Oliver's head snapped up. Through his office window, he could see into the building across the street, and there, standing at a window, was Margaret. She looked different, blonde now, dressed simply, but her smile was the same. She pressed her hand to the glass. Oliver found himself doing the same, their hands aligned across the distance. For a moment, they stayed like that, separated by glass and space, but connected by something stronger. Then Margaret stepped back, blew him a kiss, and disappeared into the busy office behind her. Oliver smiled, knowing she was already gone. But this time it felt different. This time he understood. She hadn't left him. She'd given him what he needed most, the truth about himself. Later that evening, in his new apartment, smaller than the penthouse, but with better views of the sunset, Oliver sat with Liam, sharing the bottle of bourbon they'd been saving for a special occasion. "You're not going to look for her?" Liam asked. Oliver touched the photograph in his pocket. "No, she'll find me when she's ready, or she won't. That's her choice. And you're okay with that? Not being in control. That's what she taught me in the end." Oliver smiled at his friend. "That real love isn't about control. It's about trust, about letting people be who they really are, even if that means letting them go." "You've changed," Liam observed. "We all have." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the city lights come alive. Oliver thought about the Margaret he'd first met, so careful with her secrets, and the woman he'd glimpsed today, finally free to be herself. He thought about the man he'd been, obsessed with control, and who he was becoming. Someone who understood that life's greatest moments can't be planned or controlled, only lived. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "The Barrett Foundation meeting tomorrow. Wear the blue tie. It brings out your eyes." Oliver smiled but didn't respond. He didn't need to. Whatever happened next, whether Margaret came back into his life or remained a beautiful memory, he was finally ready to let the story unfold on its own. Because sometimes the greatest love stories aren't about the endings. They're about the changes we make in each other along the way. The walls we help each other break down, the freedom we find in letting go. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, they're about finding our way back to each other, not because we have to, but because we choose to. Oliver touched the glass of his window, remembering Margaret's hand aligned with his across the distance. Somewhere out there, she was watching the same sunset, living her own life, making her own choices. And that, he realized, was the purest form of love. Not possession, not control, but the joy of seeing someone become exactly who they were meant to be, even if that meant watching them fly away. For now, the end. That was a beautiful story, wasn't it? I hope you enjoyed it. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Your collaboration is very important to me.